The gavel detonates and the courtroom shivers as Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Order." The coffee cup falls, and Morgan Hale feels the floor tilt as Victor Raines said, "The witness will answer." The air tastes like coins and fear as Dana Whitlock said, "Objection. Argumentative." The gallery gasps and Jack Mercer stops writing as Morgan Hale said, "I was told to keep quiet." A juror's knuckles whiten, and Lena Brooks looks down as the bailiff steadies the aisle. Caleb Ward watches from the rail and his jaw barely moves as he mutters to no one. Dana Whitlock said, "You pressured her, counselor," and the defense table thrums with panic. Victor Raines said, "The truth scares thieves," and the line lands like a knife. Morgan Hale said, "I was a witness 10 minutes ago," and her pulse drums against the microphone. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Miss Hale, answer only what is asked," and the ceiling lights seem to lower. The room holds its breath, and the case swallows her name before it can save her. The hallway hums like a hive as the doors swing, and Morgan Hale said, "They turned me mid-sentence." Dana Whitlock said, "We pivot, we don't panic," yet her pen cap bears new bite marks. Fluorescent lights buzz and the rain drums, a flat rhythm against old glass. Victor Raines strides past and does not glance as he said, "Recess is for amateurs." Jack Mercer lingers with a question that smells like bait as he said, "Were you coached to stall?" Morgan Hale said, "I coached myself to breathe," and her throat tightens. A bailiff nods toward the clock, and time feels like a rope. Caleb Ward stands at the far end, a silhouette holding a secret as he said, "Careful where you bleed." Dana Whitlock said, "He is not our friend," and her voice hides a tremor. Morgan Hale said, "Someone fed him my notes," and the corridor shrinks. The elevator dings and the doors refuse to save her, as if they know the verdict already. The press swarm blooms like algae as cameras rise, and Jack Mercer said, "Off the record, unless you say otherwise." Victor Raines said, "Justice hates delay," and his smile feeds the lenses. Morgan Hale said, "Justice hates liars," and the microphones lean closer. Dana Whitlock said, "No statements, but reporters smell thunder." A headline forms midair and spells her ruin before ink exists. Caleb Ward threads through the bodies like a rumor as he said, "The question you dodge will try the back door." Morgan Hale said, "Which door did you open?" and her pulse answers for him. Jack Mercer said, "Did the company pay you to bury audits?" and silence cracks. The cameras blink as if surprised by their own hunger. Victor Raines said, "We welcome daylight," and the crowd laughs like glass breaking. A conference room with carpet that drinks secrets holds them, while a clock scolds. And Dana Whitlock said, "We lock down our leaks." Morgan Hale said, "Someone knows my drafts," and the word "someone" tastes like betrayal. Case files sprawl like a map of wounds. Dana Whitlock said, "Your audit notes referenced 3 names, and the names carry teeth." Morgan Hale said, "Thomas Greer brokered hush favors," and the air turns metallic. Dana Whitlock said, "If Greer flips, Raines will mount your head on opening." Morgan Hale said, "He already has a nail picked out," and she forces a smile. Caleb Ward knocks once and opens without waiting as he said, "You two should pick fewer enemies." Dana Whitlock said, "You first," and she closes a folder like a trap. Morgan Hale said, "If you're selling both sides, name your price," and hope flinches under the table. They return to the chamber where the ceiling feels lower, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, "We resume." The bailiff's shoes tick like metronomes. Victor Raines said, "New exhibit for the witness," and a screen blinks awake. Morgan Hale said, "That email was draft only, but the subject line burns." Dana Whitlock said, "Foundation is lacking," and her hand anchors the table. The jurors lean as if gravity shifted toward the screen. Caleb Ward sits 3 rows back and does not blink as he said, "Drafts become graves." Jack Mercer writes faster, turning breath into copy. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Proceed," and the cables under the table look like snakes. Morgan Hale said, "I did not send it," and somewhere a lock clicks in her memory. The jury files back into their box as if chained to the wood, and Morgan Hale said, "Every eye measures my breath." Dana Whitlock said, "Let them measure lies instead," but her voice cracks on the last word. Victor Raines said, "A witness' silence stains louder than speech, and the screen behind him glows with cold light." Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Keep to the facts though her gaze narrows." The jurors lean forward, caught between curiosity and dread. Morgan Hale said, "If I speak, I fracture, and the air thickens like wet wool." Dana Whitlock said, "If you don't, they'll hang you on a shadow," and her hand trembles under the table. Caleb Ward studies them from the rear bench, the ghost of a smirk creeping across his lips. "Morgan Hale," said, "somebody spoon feeds him my soul," and her eyes cut toward Caleb before she swallows it back. The gallery breathes in one collective gasp, waiting for blood. In the side chamber, the hum of a failing fluorescent light claws at the silence, and Dana Whitlock said, "They want a confession carved from fear." Morgan Hale said, "Fear is the only tool they sharpen." Victor Raines' voice filters through the wall, sharp, even muffled. Morgan Hale said, "He drills holes until I leak," and her hand drifts to her throat. Dana Whitlock said, "I've defended men who killed with less pressure." Morgan Hale said, "Then you know I am drowning," and her eyes blur. Caleb Ward steps inside as if summoned by ghosts, and he said, "Both sides pay me to carry buckets." Dana Whitlock said, "Then you drown first," and slams a folder shut. Morgan Hale said, "You enjoy feeding the fire," and Caleb only smirks. The buzzing grows louder, like insects gnawing at the truth. The hallway becomes a gauntlet as reporters swarm, their flashes popping like lightning. And Jack Mercer said, "Is silence your new alibi?" Morgan Hale said, "Silence is safer than your ink," and her jaw tightens. Dana Whitlock said, "No questions, but microphones crowd anyway." Victor Raines sweeps past with a remark. She hides what cannot stand daylight, and the swarm bends toward him. Morgan Hale said, "He builds castles on ash, but the words vanish under shutters." Caleb Ward watches from the stairwell shadows, and he said, "The more they chase, the less they see." Jack Mercer said, "What are they not supposed to see?" and his pen waits. Morgan Hale said, "The truth is never for sale," but the crowd laughs bitterly. Dana Whitlock pulls her close and whispers, "They already bought the ending," and the hall roars louder than thunder. The defense office smells of dust and ink, and Dana Whitlock said, "This case drips poison from the ceiling." Morgan Hale said, "Someone pours it for them," and her hands shake over the files. Dana Whitlock said, "If Caleb is their spigot, cut him off," and she slams down a photograph. Morgan Hale said, "Cut him off and he leaks more," and she leans against the table. The blinds slice the room into prison bars. Dana Whitlock said, "We can't fight smoke with mirrors," and her eyes flash. Morgan Hale said, "Then fight with fire," and the word scorches the air. Caleb Ward enters without knocking, smirk fading into steel. He said, "You talk of fire, but I carry matches." Dana Whitlock said, "One day you'll choke on the smoke," and the room trembles in silence. Morgan Hale said, "Until then, I burn," and the page curls in her hand. Back in court, the storm outside has softened, but tension thickens, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, "We reconvene." Victor Raines said, "The state calls Thomas Greer," and the name ripples through the room. Morgan Hale said, "Greer holds a knife I cannot see," and her stomach knots. Dana Whitlock said, "We knew this shadow would step forward," and her pen digs into paper. Thomas Greer, weary and gaunt, steps into the witness box with a tremor. Victor Raines said, "Tell them what she buried," and the silence lurches forward. Morgan Hale said, "He barters lies for air," and her nails dig into the wood. Caleb Ward whispers from behind, "Or sells truth to the highest bidder," and his words slither into her spine. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Proceed," and the room shrinks. Dana Whitlock said, "This is the dagger moment," and the jury leans like a wave cresting toward collapse. The courtroom feels like a furnace as Thomas Greer's words drip venom, and Victor Rains said, she doctored the ledgers. Morgan Hale said, he forged them himself, but the jury shifts uneasily. Dana Whitlock said, objection, speculation, yet her voice trembles. Judge Eleanor Pike said, overruled, and the gavel taps like a coffin nail. Thomas Greer said, she buried payments under false codes, and his eyes gleam with survival. Morgan Hale said, you are the liar I once trusted, and her throat burns. The gallery murmurs like a hive, as Jack Mercer scribbles with frantic hunger. Caleb Ward watches the exchange, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Dana Whitlock said, the witness barters lies for his own skin, and her hand shakes over her notes. Morgan Hale said, every truth I speak drowns under their noise, and the silence afterward feels crueler than applause. In chambers, the tension breathes louder than voices, and Dana Whitlock said, we're bleeding out on the stand. Morgan Hale said, he twisted my audits into daggers, and her hands clench. Dana Whitlock said, Greer rehearsed this with Rains, and she slams her pen. Morgan Hale said, then Caleb fed them, and her glare pierces the walls. Caleb Ward appears silent at first, then he said, both sides keep me alive. Dana Whitlock said, one day both sides will hang you, and her eyes blaze. Morgan Hale said, why poison my defense, and her throat trembles. Caleb Ward said, truth is a coin, and I flip it where it lands, and his smirk cuts deeper. Dana Whitlock said, this coin will buy your ruin, and the clock ticks too loud. Morgan Hale whispers, or mine first, and silence collapses around them. The press swallows the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like gunfire, and Jack Mercer said, was Greer your accomplice or your enemy? Morgan Hale said, he was both, and her voice cracks. Dana Whitlock said, step aside, but microphones stab forward. Victor Rains said, she admits her guilt in riddles, and the crowd roars. Morgan Hale said, I admit nothing but betrayal, and her eyes dart to Caleb in the crowd. Caleb Ward said, stories pay better than silence, and his grin widens. Jack Mercer said, so which story sells best? And his pen hovers like a blade. Dana Whitlock pulls Morgan by the elbow, whispering, do not feed them as shutters fire. Morgan Hale said, they already ate my name, and the sound of rain drowns her last word. The crowd surges as though it smells blood. Inside the defense office, papers scatter like leaves in a storm, and Dana Whitlock said, we're being gutted piece by piece. Morgan Hale, said Greer, sold my drafts, and her fingers tear through files. Dana Whitlock said, he learned those details from someone closer, and her eyes narrow. Morgan Hale said, closer than Greer, and her gaze drifts to the shadowed corner. Caleb Ward emerges slowly, and he said, everyone needs an exit plan. Dana Whitlock said, your plan is treason, and she slams her hand on the desk. Morgan Hale said, if you sold me, I burn too, and her voice cracks. Caleb Ward said, I sell survival, nothing else, and his eyes harden. Dana Whitlock said, survival demands loyalty, and silence slices the room. Morgan Hale said, I no longer know who sits beside me, and her chest heaves like it might break. The courtroom resumes like a slow knife drawn, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, we continue. Victor Rains said, Exhibit C shows her signature forged for gain, and the jurors lean closer. Morgan Hale said, that is not my mark, and her heart slams against ribs. Dana Whitlock said, the exhibit lacks chain of custody, and her voice cuts sharp. Victor Rains said, excuses are a thief's refuge, and his tone coils like a whip. Morgan Hale said, you stitch lies with my skin, and sweat beads on her temple. Thomas Greer smirks from the witness box, silent but damning. Caleb Ward whispers from the gallery, proof is what survives the fire, and Morgan's eyes widen. Judge Eleanor Pike said, the record will hold, and the gavel taps again. The silence grows thick as the jury scribbles their judgment onto fragile pads. The lights dim for a projection none of them expected, and Jack Mercer said, "Source verified." A waveform blooms on the screen as Victor Rains said, "Play it." A hiss, then Caleb Ward said, "Payment clears if the notes arrive before recess." Dana Whitlock said, "Pause that." And color drains from her face. Morgan Hale said, "You sold me twice," and the room tilts. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "We will hear it through," and the gallery swallows its breath. Caleb Ward said, "Both sides burn unless I hold the hose," and a murmur flares. Dana Whitlock said, "This is spliced, but doubt lands like hail." Victor Rains said, "Admissions need no editing," and he smiles for the jury. Morgan Hale said, "He names my draft, my timestamp, my fear," and Lena Brooks looks away. The recording ends with a click that feels like a verdict beginning. In chambers, the storm finds a second voice in the radiator, and Dana Whitlock said, "That clip amputated context." Morgan Hale said, "What context saves me now?" and her fingers knot. Jack Mercer said, "There is a second file," and he sets a drive down. Dana Whitlock said, "Chain of custody yet reaches anyway." The playback shows Victor Rains saying, "Delivered juror profiles with the draft." Morgan Hale said, "He mapped their fears, and the words sting." Caleb Ward's voice returns, "Include Lena Brooks. She breaks under family debt." Dana Whitlock said, "He poisoned the box," and fury steadies her hand. Jack Mercer said, "My source feared burying this," and his eyes plead. Morgan Hale said, "You were the source," and he flinches. Judge Eleanor Pike called in, said, "If true, we approach the cliff edge of Mistrial," and the clock stutters. Back in court, Victor Rains said, "Defense theatrics." Dana Whitlock said, "Full recording, Your Honor," and her spine straightens. The audio continues past the cut as Caleb Ward said, "No jurors, no drafts, or the press learns your backroom ask." Victor Rains said, "You have no leverage," and the silence snarls. Morgan Hale said, "He tried to stop him and the gallery stirs." Caleb Ward said, "Pick your scandal," and a chair creaks in the jury box. Dana Whitlock said, "The state solicited prejudicial intel," and the words ring. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Mr. Rains, step carefully," and a chill finds the room. Victor Rains said, "Negotiation is not coercion," yet his jaw twitches. Morgan Hale said, "He wanted my notes to bend a juror with debt," and Lena Brooks blinks hard. The blade that looked, aimed at Morgan, pivots midair. The defense office becomes a war room of ruin and math, and Dana Whitlock said, "If Lena carries debt, Rains hunted weakness." Morgan Hale said, "I will not be saved by another wound," and she exhales like glass. Caleb Ward stands between light strips and shadow bars, and he said, "Choose where the truth lands." Dana Whitlock said, "Confess your arrangement on the record," and pushes a recorder forward. Caleb Ward said, "Confession requires a parachute," and his eyes stay cold. Morgan Hale said, "Name the payments, name the couriers," and her voice steadies. Caleb Ward said, "I'll trade names for immunity," and the carpet holds their heat. Dana Whitlock said, "Then jump without it," and she clicks the recorder. Caleb Ward finally said, "2 transfers from a fundraiser shell tied to the DA's campaign," and the room tilts. Morgan Hale said, "So that is why my drafts bled," and the decision hardens. The courtroom returns to a slow, surgical silence, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, "Proceed with your witness." Dana Whitlock said, "The defense calls Caleb Ward," and the gallery rustles like leaves. Caleb Ward said, "I sold fear to both sides until fear wanted me dead," and his voice is iron. Victor Rains said, "Lies from a parasite, but his eyes dart." Dana Whitlock said, "Name the shell and the handler," and she does not blink. Caleb Ward said, "Civic River Pack, handled by Thomas Greer for the campaign," and a whisper detonates. Morgan Hale said, "Greer funded his own rescue," and the jury stiffens. Judge Eleanor Pike said, "The court will recess to consider sanctions," and the gavel finds bone. Victor Rains said, This is theater, but sweat slicks his collar. Dana Whitlock said, it is sunlight, and the room finally breathes a colder air. Morning breaks like a blade over varnished wood, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, we proceed to closings. Victor Rains said, the state offers a simple map, and he points to glowing exhibits. Morgan Hale said simple maps hide cliffs and breath fogs in her chest. Dana Whitlock said, you were shown fragments sharpened into spears and her knuckles pale. Victor Rains said, follow the money to her pen, and the jurors lean. Morgan Hale said, my pen never touched that lie, and her pulse hammers. Thomas Greer looks down pretending to pray, and Jack Mercer keeps writing. Caleb Ward stares at the floor as if a trap waits below. Dana Whitlock said, the pack fed Greer, and fear fed the rest, and silence thickens. Victor Rains said, diversions are the last refuge of guilt, and he smiles thinly. Morgan Hale said, I survived by telling the truth they buried, and she does not blink. Judge Eleanor Pike said, counsel will proceed, and the room braces for impact. Victor Rains steps into the aisle like a conductor, and he said, this case is intent dressed as innocence. He threads Greer's ledger pages together like chains. Morgan Hale said, those links are wax and the chain sags. Victor Rains said, she profited when audits vanished and the screens pulse. Dana Whitlock said, profit requires proof, not rumor in costume, and the jury exhales. Victor Rains said, her drafts aligned with payments, and a graph climbs. Morgan Hale said, my drafts recorded rot, not reward, and her eyes sting. Victor Rains said, Greer corroborates what the numbers scream, and he holds the room. Caleb Ward does not move, a stone in a river. Jack Mercer said, he sells a finale before the truth arrives, and his pen stalls. Judge Eleanor Pike said, conclude, Mr. Rains, and tension cinches tight. Victor Rains said, the state rests its blade on justice and steps back into shadow. Dana Whitlock rises like a verdict in human form, and she said, the state chained you to fear. She lays down the pack transfers like bones. Morgan Hale said, they built a noose from my drafts, and her jaw tightens. Dana Whitlock said, Greer took money to craft a lie, then sold the lie as law, and the gallery stills. Caleb Ward said, I brought both flames, yet warned of the burn, and his voice is gravel. Dana Whitlock said, he warned because the buyer switched hands, and she side-eyes Rains. Victor Rains said, counsel argues conspiracy to hide guilt, and his smile strains. Dana Whitlock said, I argue sunlight, and she clicks the full recording. The jurors hear the pressure, the juror mapping, the death. Morgan Hale said, they hunted Lena Brooks, not evidence, and Lena swallows. Dana Whitlock said, you must decide if justice is a market, and her words hang. Judge Eleanor Pike said, the jury will recall only evidence, and the gavel kisses wood. A sudden recess draws them into the corridor's echo, and Morgan Hale said, if I lose on truth. Dana Whitlock said, you will not lose to theater, and squeezes her shoulder. Jack Mercer said, off the record, the city wants a fall, and he meets her eyes. Morgan Hale said, then let it be the right head, and a ghost of a smile forms. Caleb Ward steps close enough to count heartbeats, and he said, my confession buys only smoke. Dana Whitlock said, your confession buys a fuse, and she steps in. Victor Rains passes with a nod that feels like a blade. Morgan Hale said, I will not beg your mercy, and the blade misses. Jack Mercer said, the headline is bending, and his pen returns to life. Dana Whitlock said, in 5 minutes, I set the match, and her breath steadies. Morgan Hale said, light it, and the elevator dings like a bell before a fight. They return to a room that feels like a throat, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, final words. Dana Whitlock said, the law is not a marketplace, and her voice cuts clean. She threads the timeline like a surgeon stitching. Morgan Hale said, I kept records because rot grows in dark, and the jurors listen. Dana Whitlock said, Greer's money trail meets the pack and stops at power, and she points. Victor Raines said. She seeks pity, not proof, and his eyes shine hard. Dana Whitlock said, proof is what survived the fire, and she gestures to the full cut. Caleb Ward said, I played both sides, but truth outlived me, and he lowers his head. Jack Mercer writes one word, then circles it twice. Morgan Hale said, do not buy a verdict from fear, and her voice steadies. Judge Eleanor Pike said, members of the jury, you will retire, and the room exhales a prayer it cannot finish. The jury room door yawns and 12 faces return carved from ours, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? A paper rustles like winter leaves. Morgan Hale said, breathe, and her ribs obey like strangers. Dana Whitlock said, whatever lands, we build from it, and her hand finds the table edge. Victor Raines watches the foreperson as if he wrote her heartbeat. The foreperson said on count 1, and the gallery freezes in place. Caleb Ward sits 3 rows back with a silence that feels like debt. Jack Mercer lifts his pen and does not blink. Morgan Hale said, if I fall telling it straight, and the words warm nothing. The foreperson said, not guilty, and the room exhales like a ruptured dam. Victor Raines said, proceed to count 2, and his jaw resets. Dana Whitlock said, hold, and her fingers unclench. The foreperson said, not guilty, and a sob cracks somewhere behind them. Silence lingers as if the walls refuse to believe it, and Judge Eleanor Pike said, members of the jury, you are dismissed. The benches creak like old ships. Morgan Hale said, freedom tastes metallic, and tears threaten mutiny. Dana Whitlock said, freedom tastes earned, and she folds the verdict slip. Victor Raines gathers his files like a man burying a storm. Jack Mercer said, statement for the record, and waits with ink hungry. Morgan Hale said, I thank the 12 who listened, and her voice steadies. Caleb Ward stands, then sits, then stands again, and he said, the truth cost blood. Dana Whitlock said, it cost more than that, and she stares at Greer. Thomas Greer lowers his head as if the ceiling might fall. Judge Eleanor Pike said, sanctions will be addressed, and the gavel becomes a metronome. Morgan Hale said, I am still here, and the words finally find heat. The corridor blooms with microphones like metal flowers, and Jack Mercer said, not guilty on both counts, what now? Morgan Hale said, now I learn to breathe without walls, and a flash blinds her. Dana Whitlock said, we pursue remedies for misconduct, and she names the statutes. Victor Raines walks past with a measured nod that refuses apology. A reporter shouts about the peak and the shell. Morgan Hale said, power is not proof, and her mouth firms. Caleb Ward edges to the fringe, and he said, my confession will not buy me a home. Dana Whitlock said, your confession buys daylight, and her stare carries steel. Jack Mercer said, did the juror mapping sway anything? And the corridor hums. Morgan Hale said, we saw the attempt, and the attempt failed, and her shoulders loosen. Somewhere a janitor wheels a bucket like a slow hymn, washing footprints from a storm. The defense office breathes like a chest after sprinting, and Dana Whitlock said, civil claims first, then the bar complaint. Morgan Hale said, I want restitution for the smear, and her hands fold. Dana Whitlock said, we file against Greer and the shell, and she opens a fresh pad. Caleb Ward steps in, hatless and thinner than morning, and he said, immunity talks began. Dana Whitlock said, they will ask if you invent, and her eyebrow lifts. Caleb Ward said, I will deliver wire trails and couriers, and his voice stays flat. Morgan Hale said, why help now? And the room narrows. Caleb Ward said, because both fires now burn me, and he looks older. Dana Whitlock said, then bring names and dates, and she closes a binder like a door. Morgan Hale said, we rebuild with receipts, and the phrase tastes like steel. Outside, sirens pass, uninterested in this small victory. Dusk stains the steps as the courthouse exhales its last crowd, and Jack Mercer said, "One line for tomorrow." Morgan Hale said, "Write that fear did not get to buy me," and her breath ghosts in the cool air. Dana Whitlock said, "Write that the market closed," and she almost smiles. Victor Rains pauses at the curb, and he said, "Until the next case," and vanishes into a gray sedan. Thomas Greer leaves under a cloud that looks like handcuffs. Caleb Ward said, "I will deliver what I promised," and he turns toward a different street. Morgan Hale said, "I will sleep with every light on and call it peace," and the sky bruises. Dana Whitlock said, "Tomorrow we sharpen the filings," and she pockets her pen. Jack Mercer said, "The city wanted a fall and got a mirror," and he caps his recorder. Morgan Hale said, "I am still here," and the last word feels like a lock finally unpicked. Night presses against Morgan's windows like a slow tide, and Morgan Hale said, "Silence used to feel like a verdict." The apartment hums with the fridge's small courage, and the city breathes far away. Dana Whitlock said, "Sleep or at least pretend," over the phone, and the line crackles like paper. Morgan Hale said, "Pretend can hold till morning," and her eyes trace boxes of files like tombstones. Jack Mercer said, "I filed a piece that leaves teeth marks," and he waits for anger. Morgan Hale said, "Bite the truth, not me," and a laugh becomes something almost kind. Caleb Ward said, "I sent the courier list in a message that refuses apology." Morgan Hale said, "Send your conscience if you find it," and the message shows read, then nothing. The rain remembers the case and runs its finger down the glass. Dana Whitlock said, "I'll be at your door by 8, and the promise steadies her ribs. Morgan Hale said, "Bring coffee and a future," and she kills the lamp. The room doesn't darken, it just stops lying about the light. Morning curls into the courthouse plaza with a pale bruise of sky, and Lena Brooks said, "I read the rules twice last night." Morgan Hale said, "The rules read us back," and a smile struggles. Lena Brooks said, "Debt is loud, but I kept my ears," and she hugs her coat tight. Morgan Hale said, "Your listening saved me," and the ground feels less like water. Jack Mercer hovers with a respectful distance, and he said, "No cameras, just thanks." Morgan Hale said, "Thanks are receipts I can pay," and she nods to him. Dana Whitlock joins with a steam of coffee, and she said, "The filings leave at 9. Morgan Hale said, "Leave nothing behind but the rot," and her breath fogs. Lena Brooks said, "Tell them to stop hunting jurors," and the wind lifts her hair. Morgan Hale said, "Tell them yourself if you want," and Lena's chin rises. The plaza wakes with shoes that don't know what happened here, and the day decides not to bleed. A diner smells like rescue disguised as coffee. And Jack Mercer said, "I wrote that sunlight hurt everyone, including me." Morgan Hale said, "Hurt is honest when it pays in scars," and the cups meet the counter. The waitress refills without asking, like Mercy practiced. Dana Whitlock said, "Your piece balanced like a bridge with missing boards," and she slides him a copy. Jack Mercer said, "I left the juror's privacy sealed," and the headline glows. Morgan Hale said, "Protect the listener and punish the hunting," and her jaw eases. Caleb Ward enters with a wind that carries apologies, and he said, "I met with the feds an hour ago." Dana Whitlock said, "You will meet them again with documents," and her voice is iron. Caleb Ward said, "I will carry this stain till it fits," and his hands stop shaking. Morgan Hale said, "Make it fit the truth, not your legend," and he nods. The bell over the door rings, like a small, forgiving jury. A hearing room tightens its tie around the truth, and Dana Whitlock said, "We submit the recordings and the transfer paths." The panel chair said, "This concerns prosecutorial ethics," and pencils align. Morgan Hale said, "I came because leaving would taste like fear," and her voice doesn't wobble. Victor Rains sits with a lawyer who counts ceiling tiles, and he said, "I relied on my team through teeth." Dana Whitlock said, "Your team hunted jurors like deer in winter," and the room chills. Caleb Ward said, I routed the money, and he doesn't blink. Thomas Greer said, I served a campaign, not a crime, and Sweat learns his collar. The panel chair said, we will sanction where the law demands, and the stack of exhibits rises like tide. Morgan Hale said, justice isn't a mirror, but it reflects, and silence nods. Dana Whitlock said, let the reflection scar the right faces, and papers whisper. The gavel here is smaller, but it hits the same bone. Twilight drapes the river with a bruise that finally fades, and Morgan Hale said, the water never testifies, but it remembers. Dana Whitlock said, we filed, we warned, we wake tomorrow, and the city lights ignite like steady jurors. Jack Mercer said, I'll keep the story breathing without feeding it fear, and the notebook closes. Caleb Ward lingers at the rail like a man inventorying sins, and he said, I'll let the truth spin me down to nothing. Morgan Hale said, then maybe it buys you back, and the wind carries it. Across the water, a ferry slips by without witnesses, and that feels right. Dana Whitlock said, you wanted one last line, and her mouth softens. Morgan Hale said, write that I am no one's market, and the river nods. Jack Mercer said, it's better than a verdict, and his smile is tired. Morgan Hale said, I am still here, and that is the sentence I choose, and the night finally leaves the bench.